Cheers, Rockets fans. Welcome to The Locker Line, an exclusive podcast from the home of the Rockets.
Whoa!
Sports Talk 790.
Rockets!
The Locker Line is proudly served to you by Carbox Clutch City Lager.
It is good!
Oh, yeah? Red Nation, get ready. Get ready. The Locker Line starts now.
Welcome aboard.
Welcome in to another new episode of The Lager Line, served to you courtesy of Clutch City Lager of Carbach Brewing. I'm your host, Ben Dubose, editor of USA Today's Rockets Wire and contributor to Sports Talk 790, the official flagship radio station of your Houston Rockets. Joined on this Thursday evening by Paulo Alves, my good friend, co-host out of Portugal, produces these episodes as well. Paulo, I feel like since the last time we spoke a week ago, this has been about as positive of a rebuilding week as you could have, in the sense that last Friday night, Jabari Smith Jr. continued his really strong run of form in March. He had the buzzer beater against the Pelicans, gave the Rockets a feel-good win. And then the 3 games since, there's been lots of bright spots with your young prospects. Jalen Green has broken 30 twice, broke 40 once, and was efficient in both of those games. Jabari made 4 threes in Memphis. Alperen Şengün came back with 25 points, one of his better games of the year. Tari Eason set a career high. Both Jabari and Tari getting some really high praise after the game from Draymond Green of the Warriors. We'll talk about that today. But honestly, the bottom line, a lot of bright spots, and the Rockets were competitive in all of these games, yet they lost 3 of the 4. And so it's one of those, you get the feel-good win, yet you don't really cost yourself in any way when it comes to the draft race and securing maximum lottery odds, which comes from having one of the bottom 3 records, and the Rockets are getting very close to that. As far as I see, it's a pretty ideal week. You're getting lots of bright spots across the board. You're competitive even with teams like the Pelicans, the Warriors, the Grizzlies that are playing for either playoff seeding or to try and lock down a playoff spot. To me, this is what you're hoping for. This is what, when people question during the season, well, what should a rebuild look like? Because obviously your record isn't going to be good no matter what. To me, this is much more like it. This is competitive, fun basketball with a team that's bought in, and maybe 1 or 2 games, you're going to get the bounces to go your way, the way they did when Jabari sank that shot at the end of last Friday's game. Others, you might not get the bounces your way late in the game, like they didn't go the direction of the Rockets on Wednesday in Memphis. But the bottom line, this is what you're looking for, about as peak of a rebuilding week as you could ask for, right?
Yeah, and not only that, I mean, usually we say that we want to be as competitive as possible and still lose in the end. That's kind of changed a little bit as far as my philosophy goes. I just, you can't understate how important these last couple of weeks have been, or I think they've been, for the development of the young guys. You can tell, we constantly talk about the rot of losing, and there's something to be said about the effort Jalen Green in specific is putting on the defensive end of the floor, and that comes from winning a couple of games and upping morale a little bit. Besides that, one of the takeaways is I don't think there's any way we finish last in the league. I think Detroit's ran away with that one. We have 2 more wins than them. But on the other hand, both Charlotte and the Spurs had wins across the same span, and so we've at the same time been able to, even while winning, been able to keep our place at least as the second worst team in the league when it comes to the floor of those lottery odds.
I will say you do have a Rockets-Pistons game coming up a week from Friday. So I think it's highly likely the Rockets are going to win that game. It is in Houston. But I'm just saying you do have that in your back pocket. If somehow the Rockets could lose that game, theoretically getting maximum odds is still on the table. But, we shouldn't say getting maximum odds, getting a maximum floor. Because, again, your odds at one of the 4 lottery picks are identical as long as you're in the bottom 3. And at this point, with 5 games of separation between the Rockets and Hornets and only 9 games left, I'm about ready to call it. I've seen enough. The bottom line is the Rockets, they don't have to worry about the draft considerations as much anymore. So it is a bit easier to take these bright spots as well. And if we zoom back a little bit, They're 5-6 in their last 11 games, 3-3 in their last 6. They had the 3-game winning streak in there. It's the most competitive run of form they've had all season. And that's part of what's been so disconcerting about this particular team. Even a year ago, and I guess you could point out that they had Christian Wood and Eric Gordon, so they were slightly more veteran laden, but they had that 7-game winning streak, even though it was pretty random in early December. The Rockets never had any run this year more than for a couple of games. So to see them hover around 500 for basically a full month to this point, there's a lot of things that have gone well. And I think you actually hit the biggest takeaway in the macro, besides the obvious of Jabari breaking out and not being a liability anymore. I think Jalen Green competing harder on the defensive end. My theory on what's happened with this Rockets team this month, I really think the month of February was them bottoming out between the trade deadline, shipping off Eric Gordon, and then, of course, at that point, you're trying to insert KJ Martin into the starting lineup. That's paid some dividends once they started getting people back. But then you had those blowout losses to Oklahoma City where they could have lost by 50 plus each time, just laughably uncompetitive. The games out of the All-Star break where Silas just did not trust Şengün for whatever reason. Damian Lillard dropped 71 on them. That was the bottom falling out. And of course, it coincided with the second month of Kevin Porter Jr. not being out there. And then Jalen Green, one of those two Oklahoma City games, went out with the groin injury. And it just felt like that since those two guys came back, basically February 28th, the last day of the month for Jalen, and March 1st, the following day for KPJ, they've been a lot more, I guess, dialed in terms of KPJ. He's not making every read properly, of course. He's not a traditional point guard, but he has done a better job in general of limiting the turnovers, being a bit more crisp in his decision making. And Jalen in particular, it's not just the fact that shots are going in. It just feels like he's processing the game so much better.
Hey man, let's be honest here. KPJ got a triple-double in the last game. If we're judging by
that's
2017 MVP standards, he's basically locked in at this point. Just point guard for the future.
Yeah, of course. But no, I mean, I think the bigger thing too is just defensively, the rotations are sound. They're not taking plays off. It's just night and day different from how it looked early in the season. It felt like that they just said enough is enough and started basically taking ownership. And quite frankly, they should, especially after trading Eric Gordon. They are suddenly the longest tenured guys. It really is their team. And we talk a lot about Jabari and Tari having the right attitude, but they're rookies. Jalen and KPJ, those are the guys that have been there, done that. So I think a lot of this turnaround has just come from the fact that, they're playing harder and they're not checking out as easily when things don't go well. And I really like what we've seen from, I think, the two games they fell behind. That second New Orleans game when they got down 20 in the first half, and then the Golden State game, which was night 2 of a back-to-back and no Şengün. Both of those were the quintessential game in which it would have been very easy for the Rockets to just say, hey, it's not our night, and just mail it in. And that didn't happen. And, well, quite frankly, you could say the same thing about the Memphis game when the Grizzlies hit them with that big run, and there's all the emotion of Ja Morant coming back in the first half. And in all three of those, even though the Rockets did not win, they kept pushing, they kept fighting. And to me, that's a really good sign. And that it's exactly what we wanted to see throughout the season and didn't. And at the end of the day, look, it's just less than 1 month of form. I understand that. There's still a lot of evidence on the other side from the first 4 or 5 months. But at the same time, to me, this is noteworthy as we approach the offseason, which we've talked about ad nauseum. It's a pivotal one for the Rockets with $60 million, give or take, in cap space. And we know why they want to be aggressive, because their draft picks likely start going to Oklahoma City next year. So they're going to try and turn this thing around quickly. And a lot of the narratives that have been out there this year could really be prohibitive towards having a strong offseason and luring the types of guys, be it players, coaches, whoever it may be, as opposed to this last month. And thankfully, it's sort of the final impression. It's better. And we'll see what happens the rest of the season, these final 9 games. It is worth noting this road trip they're on now, it's not going to be friendly. They've got another one in Memphis. They've got a back-to-back against the Cavaliers and the Knicks. I suppose when they come home, they do have the Pistons, as we talked about earlier, so maybe they can fatten up a little bit there. But if they can finish the year looking competent, get above the 20-win mark, and play somewhere in the slightly below 500 range over these last 19 games. That gives you a much more solid foundation to head into the offseason and look. No one's going to say you're right on the verge of something, but at least not be looked at as a complete laughing stock. And I think that should have benefits, right?
Yeah, ultimately, we have that example that everybody always brings up before they break their breakout season. Before their breakout season, sorry, where the Suns in the bubble went on that run, and everybody uses that as an example of a team kind of finding its footing, a young team, and transitioning that into the offseason afterwards, and eventually the season. Ultimately, these last few games, besides just the wins and the losses, as you said, Jalen Green's effort for me is huge. I don't think he's anywhere close to being a good defender, especially because he dies on screens. But I do think that in some scenarios where James Harden comes back, or in scenarios where you run Jabari Smith at the 5 and you can switch this and you can move this team into a switching defense, Jalen can fit. Well, it's just an easier scheme to play, but Jalen can fit into that a lot better because he doesn't have to fight through screens as much. And his ISO defense on, at least guards at this point, he's not strong enough to deal with bigs, of course, is fairly good, especially when he's engaged, as he's been in the last few games. We've seen him. It's not only about staying in front of your man and denying the drive. It's even when your defensive player you're guarding gets by you, being able to recover and still put up a contest at the rim. And Jalen Green is so athletic that he gets to have these really great contests that only guys that can usually bank shots high off the glass can do. Usually that's reserved for when a wing is guarding a guard and they kind of contest vertically. Jalen Green is able to do that because of his athleticism, and I think that's really encouraging. Ultimately, especially if you're bringing Harden in, you can't have both of your backcourt players be a liability without one of them being good on the ball. Because otherwise, are you going to move Harden to the 3 and then have your wing that needs to be an elite on-ball defender guard the primary ball handler? It just makes things way too difficult. So if Jalen Green can be that guy to guard the primary ball handler, at the very least in ISO and as the primary matchup, I think that would be really important. And something I read an article by, I'm going to butcher his name. I'm really sorry. I think his name's Matt Isa, whatever. I'm sorry if I butchered his name. He actually sent me the article. He had a quote from it's a novel, Basketball Analytics Spatial Tracking. Dr. Stephen Shea had a quote that said, "College players are inconsistent," and this is referring to Jabari Smith Jr., but I think this applies to most young players in this league, rookies, sophomores, everything. College players are inconsistent. Their production can vary wildly from one game to the next. This is especially true for freshmen. And I'm applying freshmen in college to freshmen in the NBA and second-year players. There's a big learning curve. And it is often after the freshman season that the most elite prospects enter the draft. The moral is that consistency is not something we should expect from even the very best of prospects. It is something that players gain with experience, and it is something that can be taught. And I think this, if you follow this motto and you look at our team, the flashes we see out of these guys are insane, especially during the last week. We've seen Jalen make tough shot after tough shot. We've seen Jalen drop 40 efficiently. We've seen KPJ be a better playmaker. I don't quite think that there's a point guard there, but it's always great that he's showing these flashes. We've seen Jabari Smith Jr. look like what we thought he could be, a switchable defender that can be an elite shooter. Tyrese has been doing it all season. It's not really about consistency. But to me, it's a big deal that we're finally starting to see it work, even if it's just in short spurts. This season has been so poor, at least from a fan perspective, that we really don't have much to hold on to be optimistic. And I guess I'll use this transition a little bit into something. I think people, JJ Redick had a quote earlier in the week about the Rockets and their lack of direction and everything. And we've seen countless of those throughout the season. And I have two things that I would like to add on top of that. I think one of them is, it's interesting that we see this being said about the Rockets, and then you look at the Pistons or the Magic or the Hornets and teams like even the Spurs, and we don't see anything quite like that. And when you look at them play, they're not that much better, if they're better at all. So I think it's a combination of the Rockets being bad and the Rockets being the biggest market that is currently bad, and that's why they take a lot of the flack.
That's fair.
And then, other than that, it's if you're not optimistic at this point, after the last couple of weeks have happened, I don't think you're ever going to be optimistic because this is the best we've looked all season. We're seeing flashes of our guys, flashes of greatness from nearly all of our guys. We're even winning some games. We're at a point where if you can't be optimistic now, I mean, I think it's going to be a long time until you're actually optimistic.
Yeah, we talked about this in the Steven Silas episode. Well, it wasn't solely about Silas, but we talked about the idea that at least in terms of the national perception, it's got to be something drastic just because, especially some of the more broad-based shows, which I think what Reddick was on would definitely qualify for that. It's not going to take just a couple of weeks of 5 and 6 in your last 11 games with a 3-game winning streak sprinkled in there. That's not necessarily going to move the needle. And so I do think that while you can't rule it out, I think we both agreed, and anyone listening who wants to hear more can check out our archives, but it's going to be tough for Steven Silas to keep his job simply because that's such an easy spot that you could conceivably upgrade and bring in something more proven that could have more desirability on the market. With that said, I do think, you were talking about the positives of the last couple of weeks, and I want to read you a couple of quotes that Brian Bearfield, Big Star Sports on Twitter, got after the Rockets Warriors game, specifically about Jabari Smith Jr. and Tari Eason, the two rookies. They want to be good. They play the game the right way and go about the business of playing good basketball. That's very hard to find in today's NBA. A lot of these players want what comes from the game without putting in what it takes to be successful. Those two are always looking to improve, and as rookies, that's a good attitude to have. There's also an anecdote that Green's teammate, Klay Thompson, also praised them, particularly impressed by Jabari, who matched himself against Thompson on numerous occasions. How old is he? 20? After being informed that Smith was only 19, he whistled and shook his head. Damn, that ain't the Houston Rockets I'm used to playing against. And of course, he's referring back to his battles with James Harden, a veteran-laden team a few years ago. But then Thompson added, the sky is the limit for him. I wasn't even in the league at 19. I was a freshman in college. He has a nice-looking jump shot. He's a very talented player, and if he keeps working, he's going to be with this franchise as long as he wants. Side note, I do think it's noteworthy that Klay Thompson went out of his way to basically complement the shooting form of Jabari Smith. I think that would suggest that the little mechanical tweaks they've made over the last few weeks are certainly being noticed. And now it's back to being the type of release that we saw when he was an elite draft prospect coming out of Auburn this time a year ago. But look, Draymond, who said most of those quotes, by the way, he's going to be a free agent and he could be a plan B right after James Harden. So to have someone in the league that could conceivably be on the market within the next couple of months say those things about the team, it's a good sign. Now, of course, he talked about the bad habits as well. That's obvious, but that's true of any bad team. That's, I think, the distinction that needs to be made, and where I think the Rockets are making some headway the last couple of weeks. And sometimes on social media and blogs, the nuance can get lost. Nobody's saying that all of a sudden the Rockets have fixed their image problems and they're going to be super desirable heading into the offseason. No, the concerns are very real. It's just if you can even bridge the gap perception wise, and I think we're starting to see some evidence, and it's deserved based on their play this month, and assuming they can hold it for a couple more weeks going into the offseason, just go from being perceived as a tire fire to being perceived as a standard young team in a rebuild. And if they are in that latter place, then to me, that's much better entering the offseason, in which, they could go after James Harden. If that doesn't work out, Draymond Green, perhaps even Jalen Brown is on the market. There's been some reports this week about his future in Boston being uncertain. He can be a free agent after 2024. And if you follow the NBA, you know how this works with stars. They very rarely actually get to free agency unless they're relatively old, like Harden is, about to be 34 years old. Guys who are younger, they have so much value that their situations typically come to a head in advance of free agency because it's just too damn detrimental to the team losing them to risk losing them for nothing. So perhaps Jalen Brown comes on the market this offseason. But the bottom line is, while the Rockets are not going to be, the ready-made contender, let's be realistic about this, that people are just chomping at the bit, other than maybe Harden because of his Houston connections, to get to. At the same time, there are so many benefits if they can just be perceived as a normal run-of-the-mill rebuilding team. And I think that's what we're transitioning to something closer to.
Yeah, I think it kind of goes. I wanted to comment on what you said about Draymond being a free agent. I think it goes both ways. I think perhaps, and we've seen this, and someone pointed this out to me. I'm not sure if it was on Twitter or if it was someone else, that when Iguodala was about to be a free agent and he wanted more money out of the Warriors,
Yeah.
he would intentionally say, "Oh, this young team's good. They just need a
Veteran
vet."
leadership. Yeah.
Yeah. So
I get it.
I can kind of see how Draymond's leaning a little bit into that. But that being said, it doesn't make me disregard their comments. I do think that I think all of our players are trying to be better. I think work ethic is something that we really can't complain about when it comes to our guys. But it is still nice to hear. It's always nice to get a compliment out of like probably the most beautiful jump shot of all time in Klay Thompson. If he's complimenting your jump shot, especially in a game where you went 1 of 4 from three, 2 of 4 from the line,
Right.
it's something that's nice to hear. If you look, just so I don't forget, over the last couple of weeks, just some trends some of those flashes that I talked about earlier. Tyrese had a 4 steal game, which is just not common. I mean, it's kind of common for him to have like 4+ stocks, but that's a pretty big deal. He had this 20 and 21 and 12 game. Jabari, after that hot stretch that he was going through, he went kind of cold for 2 games, and then he had another game that he went for 2 or 3 games, and then he had another game, last game, that he went 4 of 9 from three, and that's pretty encouraging. And Jalen specifically, this is a trend that I really want to underline. Jalen's currently a sub 80% free throw shooter. If he and the way it's looking, free throw getting to the line is going to be a big deal for him and his scoring going forward.
Right.
Especially because of his athleticism. If you're trying to score over people, people are going to have to foul you, and you're going to have to play through contact, and you're going to get a lot of fouls called for you. He hasn't. Okay, I'm knocking on wood for those who don't know. I'm not jinxing it, but he hasn't missed a free throw in 3 games, and it's not like he hasn't
Oh,
shot
geez.
many.
Dude,
He's
he's missing
shot.
a free throw Friday night now. Guarantee it.
No, I'm doing the reverse Greg Ackerman because I knocked on
Okay.
wood. Okay.
Okay. Fine.
So he went 14 for 14 3 games ago. He went 3 for 3 2 games ago. Last game he went 9 for 9. If you look at his last 8 games, he is 89% from the free throw line on 7 attempts a game, so still his usual volume. It's not like it's an anomaly. It's a key development for him to be if he can be an 85% free throw shooter, that's a huge deal for his scoring, and you can tell by the scoring outburst that he's had in these games that it is important. He's also warmed up from three, although it's only 3 games. He was 4 of 9, 3 of 7, 3 of 6. His 3 point percentage is up to nearly 34% again, which is great because that was his career average and it's down from last year. I want to make one more point about Jalen before we move on to Jalen Brown, because that's something I really want to talk about. I think it's important to look at Jalen's season within context. I don't think Jalen's had an impressive season. I think he's been fairly underwhelming because of his efficiency. At the same time, I also realize that Jalen's being put in an impossible position. If you can go on our archives and look, but I once mentioned the stat that last year 40% of Jalen's shots were off ball, and that was by far his most efficient, the most efficient he was either catch and shoot, attacking closeouts, curling off of screens, whatever. This year, 97% of his shots are not coming off the ball, which means he's ball handling a lot more.
Damn.
That's such a drastic change, and that change alone justifies a little bit of the inefficiency. But not only because you're completely remodeling your game, but also because if you look at Jalen's coach in the offseason, the point I made back in that episode as well. If you look at his play up until he came into the NBA, ideally his shot profile, not this is not who he'll mimic, but his shot profile in terms of the percentage that comes off the ball, the percentage that comes on the ball, something like Steph Curry. A guy that's going to move around screens, use his speed, use his shiftiness to gain space and get a lot of opportunities that way, but which is basically a 50-50 split. He is a true shooting guard. I don't think Jalen's a combo guard.
Agree.
And I think there was the whole discussion about is he a ceiling raiser versus a floor raiser? If you want him to be a ceiling raiser, playing off the ball is absolutely critical. And we leaned into it perhaps a little bit too much last offseason up until January. But if you want him to be the ceiling raiser, he needs to be able to play off the ball, and that shot profile is absolutely perfect. I mean, I don't think anybody in the league can argue that Steph Curry is not a ceiling raiser versus a floor raiser. I mean, you can look at the Warriors right now, and he's asked to do too much. He isn't raising the floor by that much. The team's actually has a better record without him than it has with him, although on a small sample size. But you know what I mean. It is important that we groom Jalen to have this healthy shot profile and shot diet when it comes to on ball versus off the ball, especially for bringing James Harden in, and especially because this team needs a point guard. If you're going to bring in a point guard, Jalen's going to have to play more off the ball. So within context, Jalen's season, while underwhelming, has a lot of caveats to it. He's not being put in a position that fits his skill set at all. And I suspect, going a little bit organic learning, I suspect that it's on purpose. I mean, I'm sure it's on purpose. They knew that this wasn't going to be a great season. They wanted to give Jalen as much of a chance as possible to develop on the ball because he was fairly raw last year. His handle has developed tremendously. It's one of the things that doesn't show up in the stat sheet, but you can tell by watching that his handle's way tighter than it was before. He is finishing at the rim better than he was before, even though the stats don't back it up. You can tell that he's just taking tougher shots, and if your percentages are the same but you're taking tougher shots, that means you got better because you had better shots before that were easier to make.
Mm-hmm.
So it might look like Jalen stagnated a little bit. But when you consider the difference in role that he had from last year to this year, it's actually not as it doesn't look as bad, I would say. And just the volume from volume, not only the type of shots, but the volume of shots alone is also a big difference. And the amount of games that he's had to play where guys were hurt. KPJ was hurt for a long stretch. People complain about KPJ. He's not a point guard. I agree, but he does make it easier for the other guys on this team, and Jalen Green is included in that. So yeah, I just wanted to have a little bit of a rant on Jalen because I still think that he's stealing sky high. I still think that he is the most important player on this team. We'll see who we draft this summer, but I think he's here to stay, and I'm fairly certain that he's here to stay. And I'm really excited to see how where his career goes. But I think people are going a little bit overboard on how underwhelming Jalen's season has been. Because when you look at it in context and you compare it to other shooting guards of the same mold, it's fairly similar. Although I will add a caveat really quick that yes, I know that the true shooting percentage looks similar, but back then the average true shooting percentage was lower. So it's if you look at the difference between the average and what Jalen's doing, it's a little bit bigger than what it was for the Devin Booker or Anthony Edwards or whatever guards you want to compare them to. I know that's the case, but it's still fairly comparable.
Yeah, it is. I've made this point before, but people do not do a good enough job, especially with young players, of adjusting these numbers to role and to usage. There's so much of a wide discrepancy when it comes to, is a player a creator or not? And if they are a creator, there's different types of that. As you illustrated, the Rockets gave Jalen some creation reps a year ago. Now, all of a sudden, and we talked about this, there was a pod I did with Jackson Gatlin a couple of weeks ago in which I said, look, the context really got lost. But going into this year, when you took away Christian Wood and then midway through, you lost Eric Gordon, you took away Kevin Porter Jr. for 2 months as well, the context was just dramatically different compared to even a year ago when it was a bad team. And then if you compare him to other rookies in his class that aren't primary creators for their team, it's just a total apples to oranges when it comes to evaluating those efficiency metrics. And it's just one of those things. There's so much data these days, and by and large, it's good. But there's a lot of people, including some with large platforms, that will use that as a crutch, that they'll basically substitute doing honest evaluation for just looking at the numbers and doing a comparison and thinking that's all you need to know, when in reality, everything is relative to the situation. So I'm right there with you. When you peel back and you look at the actual circumstances of Jalen's year 2 and then pair it with the growth we've had over the past month. That's what I think is really important, because you can finally see, now that they're getting some semblance of a consistent rotation that they can trust, Jabari Smith Jr. isn't a liability anymore. We're seeing the defensive improvement that you referenced earlier. Now that you're seeing some growth, yes, I understand it's still not a huge sample in the grand scheme, but there's something to hang your hat on. And so when you combine the context with the trend line, which is getting better, not just offensively, but defensively as well towards the end of the season, yeah, I'm right there with you. I'm feeling a ton better about Jalen Green. Not that I was ever down on him, but what we've seen since his comeback at the end of February has been very, very encouraging, and should leave you pretty optimistic that he's, certainly, as you mentioned, going to be here, and he's going to be, unless you land Wemby, which is a 14% shot. I mean, there's a pretty good shot that Jalen's still going to be probably the most important asset in your organization, regardless of how the rest of the lottery shakes out. Anyway, let's transition to Jaylen Brown. You touched on that. We were talking offline a bit. I know that possibility intrigues you, not just because of the reality that he could come on the market. There's also a quirk with his contract where Boston can't give him a 5-year extension. So that makes it even more possible, because there's not quite the same financial edge that there typically can be for a player of his ilk. And there have been reports, just little things here or there, that he may not be entirely happy. And, I don't want to spend too much time on it, because as with Harden, so much of it depends on how the playoffs go. If one of these teams, Boston or Philadelphia, goes on a deep run and wins a championship, then that can, mend a relationship very, very quickly. So we're just being speculative. But the bottom line is, Brown's one of those guys you should just keep your eyes peeled for, because he's a year away from an inflection point. And in many cases, the offseason before is the true inflection point, because as I mentioned leading off, nobody wants to take the risk of a superstar leaving them for zero compensation, which they could do if they actually became a free agent, which he could in 2024. So the questions are being asked, and the Rockets do have a lot of trade assets. Who knows if Jalen wants to be here? Maybe he would want his team. It is a pretty attractive market. But the bottom line is that, at least from an asset standpoint, the Rockets have enough between young players and draft assets to get in the game. It's just a matter of whether he's open to it, and whether the Rockets think that he's worth it for them, especially if he's sort of on the fence. And then you get into sort of this middle ground scenario of, well, he's not entirely opposed to you, but do you want to mortgage everything if he's not, gung-ho on being with you long term? There's lots of gray area to this. But the bottom line is, he's an all-star level player, and he's in his 20s. You'd be a fool not to at least poke around, right?
Yeah, and his archetype fits into anything. He can space the floor, he can defend, he's a switchable defender.
Right.
He does fall asleep a little bit on defense when he's off the ball, but he's the guy that's going to fit into any team you want to build. And that's the type of guy you want, especially at his age. There's a couple of angles that are important to address. The first one is Boston can't extend him, and the reason is the same thing as DeJounte Murray.
Mm-hmm.
When your first extension out of your rookie contract is not a max extension, you're not going to be able to sign for a max extension going off of that contract as a base. You're obligated to hit free agency, and then the same team you were with still has your bird rights, can still offer you the most money as far as increases via bird rights, the 8% versus the 5%. Boston still, whatever team has it, Boston or not, is going to have an advantage going into that offseason. That is true. It's also true that if you're Boston and Jalen Brown is not saying, "Hey, I want to stay long term," and he's having these questions, you should at least explore what you can get for it, because you are in the prime of your contending seasons. You're actually pretty early into it, because these guys, most of their guys, are so young. But there's also another caveat to this. If Jalen Brown makes an all-NBA team, all of a sudden that restriction is gone, because he's not considered a superstar. He's going to be super max eligible, I'm fairly certain. And so that restriction is gone. So if Jalen Brown makes an all-NBA team, it's basically moot, because the Celtics they're just going to offer him that max extension. And let's be honest, he's going to take it, because no player's ever going to leave that type of money on the table. If anything, they'll demand a trade later on. So we can kind of, from the discussion, we can kind of discard the option that Boston the option that a team can, that Boston will trade him if he makes an All NBA team. Because I saw a little bit on Twitter, people were mentioning, well, you could do an extend and trade, which is going to lead me into my next point. You can't do an extend and trade because just like Boston, whatever team trades for him inherits his bird rights, but cannot give him a max extension regardless if he doesn't make an All NBA team. And if he makes an All NBA team, then he's going to stay in Boston, so the points moot anyways. You see, there's not a lot of middle ground in this, and so when you're trading for him, and now from the Rockets' standpoint in specific, when you're trading for him, you've got to realize that even if you have a wink-wink deal with him where he says, hey, if you trade for me, I'm going to re-sign in the offseason, 1 year is a long time. And I'm not judging Jalen Brown's character or anything, but you gotta be measured in the type of assets that you're going to give up for a guy that realistically has nothing stopping him from walking a year later, even if he says that he wants to stay. You can't sign an extension on the event of the trade right away, so you're going to run that risk regardless. And this is going to be something that's going to be on every team's mind because, hey, he may say, oh, I want to go to the Rockets now, I'm fine with that. But then the Rockets have a terrible season for some reason, and there's some other team that looks more enticing. He's not going to be looking back and thinking, "Oh, I promised them that I would stay." No, he's going to leave because he's even a free agent. We see guys leave or asked to leave while they're under contract. Why wouldn't the free agent just leave, regardless of if he's? We see guys leave after signing an extension a year before, or asked to leave. Why wouldn't the guy that's a free agent, even if he said that he'd sign an extension the year before, why wouldn't he leave when there's literally nothing stopping him? He doesn't even have to do the entire trade demand thing on the media, and because that's tiring for some players. Part of the reason why Kevin Durant stayed in Brooklyn for the first half of the season was he didn't want to go through the hassle of boycotting and missing practices and games because he likes the game too much. Some guys are like that. So this to say, not to talk in concrete assets. Some people say, "Oh, you're going to have to give up one of Jalen or Jabari, and then one of Şengün or Tari, which is kind of like the first and the second tier of assets that we have, and then you're going to have to give up picks on top of that." In my opinion, considering that you cannot extend them, and if you could, he'd just stay in Boston. I'm not willing to give up either Jalen or Jabari for him. It's too much of a risk. Those guys have sky high ceilings. It is unlikely that they ever become as good of a player as Jalen Brown is right now. It is unlikely. I know that, but you're buying 1 year of Jalen Brown.
Yeah, the risk of things not going right and him leaving after 1 year is simply too great. I agree.
Right, and especially when if you want to play that angle, you could just not trade for him, knowing that he's going to be a free agent, and make a run at him in free agency anyways. I do think trading for him gives you a little bit of an edge going into his free agency because you have the 8% increases versus the 5% increases, and because if he accepted to come to Houston, it's because he is at least open and he is at least optimistic with what we have, and so spending a year with the team, I think, would make it more likely that he'd resign. But this is all just chances and not the whole thing, and so I think I would go as far as Şengün, KJ Martin, or Jason Tate, or out of Garuba, Jason Tate, KJ Martin, and Josh Christopher and Ty Washington. I'm fine with giving not all of those guys, but some of those guys up, depending on what the Celtics would be interested in. I'm not sure why they would deal with the Rockets. It would likely be a 3-team trade because they want to compete. But I would give up Şengün. I think KPJ has to be in the deal, not because of salary matching or anything like that, but because I think Boston would value him. He's probably our most ready to win now player, and he can kind of fit the role to a lesser extent, of course, that Brown was playing for them as a scoring wing with not much playmaking or just a little bit of playmaking. If you're Boston and you're not trading Jalen Brown for and getting something equal back, you're going to get worse players back and draft assets with perhaps more upside. So knowing that, I think Boston would be interested in taking KPJ. The Rockets might also be interested in giving up KPJ because it is possible to trade for Jalen Brown and sign James Harden. We'll get into that later. But as I said, just to conclude the thought, I'll throw it back to you. I'd give up Şengün. I'd give up KJ Tate, Christopher, Tai, Garuba, a combination of some of those guys, and I'll give up probably both the Brooklyn picks, the ones we own outright, for Jalen Brown and for that increased chance at keeping Jalen Brown past this next year of contract, because I think if you bring in Jalen Brown with what we have, you'll still have your top pick coming in this year. Obviously, I would not give up that pick if it's top 3, or if it's top 2, top 3, I'd consider it. So I'm not giving up Wemby for 1 year of Jalen Brown. I'm not giving up Scoot Henderson for 1 year of Jalen Brown. That's fairly obvious.
Yeah,
But
it's
I
the
think
same as Jalen and Jabari. Yeah.
yeah. And so I think you're bringing him in. I think you can do something this next year that will get him to stay. And then you have obviously the financial advantage going to the offseason.
Let me ask you a related question to that. That's probably going to blend this macro discussion with the micro. So over the past month, KJ Martin has looked really good as your starting small forward. I think in March he's shooting over 82% inside the paint, which is just absolutely insane and leads the NBA. He had his career high with 31 points in the Wednesday loss at Memphis. Really, there's been signs all season long that the Rockets would pick up with more KJ usage. You could see the two-man lineups between him and Şengün were, through the first half of the year, the only positive lineup as far as the two-man combinations on your entire roster. So the hints have been there. Of course, there's politics that went into starting Eric Gordon. Now he's out, and not coincidentally, shortly after they started KJ Martin, got him, consistently in that role, and then you flip it to March and you get your two starting guards back in Jalen Green and Kevin Porter Jr. Now you're looking much more competitive, as we talked about earlier. And KJ is a big part of that. He's just 22 years old, looks really, really comfortable. And you're going to be entering an interesting offseason in which it's similar to Jae'Sean Tate a year ago. You don't have to do anything with him contractually. You have him on one more very cheap, about $2 million a year. You can bring him back next year on that and make him an unrestricted free agent in 2024 and preserve all of your cap space. Or you can potentially do something similar, although he'd probably have more bargaining power than Jae'Sean did a year ago. Basically, let him out of that deal a year early with the thought that he would give you more friendly terms. The downside, of course, you'd be eating into your theoretical cap space this summer. But the upside is that because you're going to be taking him from $2 million next season to a much higher starting figure, then he's probably incentivized to give you more reasonable terms on the second and third years of that deal, if you will, or whatever the length ends up being. The point is that you pay him more on the front end to get a more advantageous overall deal. And so it's interesting because certainly if you make any big star offer this summer, be it Jalen Brown or someone else, KJ Martin is someone that would be desirable. There were reports this season that Phoenix really, really wanted him leading up to the deadline. It just didn't make sense for the Rockets to do that because there wasn't really a big name the Rockets were going to be able to get from Phoenix in that type of configuration. But going into the offseason, look, we all talk about the abstract of $60 million in cap space. But if KJ at his age it continues to play this well, it may make sense for you to spend a bit more on the front end to eat into your flexibility with regards to the 2023 offseason to give you a deal that's more palatable over 2, 3, even 4 years, because KJ's looking like a really quality player and also a really quality trade asset. And so when we talk about these possibilities that could emerge this summer, like Jalen Brown, it's worth noting that a better deal could make KJ more of a trade asset because he wouldn't be an expiring contract. There wouldn't be that uncertainty of, well, he's going to be an unrestricted free agent, so that might cap what we get for him. The flip side, of course, is that if you give him that type of deal, you'd have to wait a period of time, I believe 60 days, right?
Yeah, 2 months.
Yeah, you'd have to wait 60 days, which I guess you can work around that. You could verbally agree to a trade. We've seen this a couple of times and, just wait to execute it until later in the offseason. I guess that's theoretically possible. But the point is that at least on paper, in the short term, it could constrict you. So it's a very interesting dynamic how KJ plays into, any of these hypothetical star pursuits, be it Jalen or someone else, because if it was a few months ago, I think I was just focused more on the abstract of just give me the most possible room that you can realistically have, and let's see how this plays out. As opposed to now, I'm sort of like, hey, let's make sure that you get this guy as quality as he looks. Let's maximize him as an asset, either long term in your rebuild or in terms of his future trade value, which probably increases if you get him on a good deal. So that's where I'm at with KJ. I would at least explore that path based on what we've seen from him. And I've seen some suggestions, by the way, that the Rockets could give him like a bloated 1 year overpay. You can't really do that anymore. You can do it to an extent. You can't do some of the comical, constructions that I've seen, these proposals of, give him like $20 million in the first year and then take it down to like 7 or 8 for year two. I don't think it quite works that way anymore. But the point is, you could definitely do something to an extent like that, just like the salaries for Jayshawn Tate are declining, I believe. So you can be flexible that way as well. But the point is, long story short, that salary cap room gives you a ton of options with KJ. And as good as he's looking, and with as desirable as he could conceivably be as a trade asset, it's making me think more and more about potentially trying to do with KJ what the Rockets did with Jayshawn Tate last summer. Where are you at on that?
I think this is one of the few things where there's an objective correct answer. Because what the Rockets can do, and now that you're remembering me of it, reminding me of it, sorry. It's been quiet on the KJ front when it comes to earlier in the season. People were talking about him being unhappy. There was the Kelly Eco report. It was a big deal for a week, like everything on Rockets Twitter.
Right.
And it's been kind of quiet ever since. And it's part of it, I think, it's Eric Gordon getting traded, but it seemed like the reason behind it was that KJ wanted an extension. The Rockets can still extend KJ today if they wanted to. We've seen guys get extended. I think even this week, there was a guy from Charlotte that got extended, Nick Richards, I think. Well, the objective correct way of handling this is KJ is you can either have KJ earned his small salary of, I think, a small loan of a $2 million. I'm joking. His salary of $2 million this night or close to it this season, and have him be an unrestricted free agent next year, or you could decline his team option or guarantee of his contract. He has both. I don't know why, but he has both. That would make him a restricted free agent right now with a very small cap hold, because he's making minimum salary, which it would not eat into your cap space. And what you can do with that is you can make all of your other signings, James Harden, whatever it is, your draft free agents, whatever free agents you bring in, and do it in a way that at the end of all of those moves, you're still the 2 million of the cap hold. And I'm not sure what the exact number, but it would be around 2 million of cap hold. That KJ would be as a restricted free agent. And at the end of that, then you extend them. Because as a team that is going to operate with cap space more than certainly, the Rockets are not going to be anywhere close to the tax line. And there's a delta between the 134 million, that's the projected salary cap for next year, and the tax line, which is projected to be at 162 million, this is what, 28 million difference. Usually teams that use cap space cannot get towards the luxury tax threshold, because once you get to the cap, the only way you can get over the cap is by minimum guys. It's by extending players you currently hold the cap hold of, because you can't have the need to renounce the cap hold when you sign out of free agents in order to extend the guy, or via the MLE, the room MLE. It has this precise name, but everybody calls it the room MLE, which is about 5.8 million protected for next year. You can only give a 2-year deal with that. And those are the only ways after you sign free agents up to the salary cap of 134 million. Those are the only ways you can go over it. But then it's not like your hard cap, but it's basically like your hard cap. You can't really do much else. And so because of that, what the Rockets should do is you sign Harden, if that's what's going to happen. You sign Victor to his deal, because that's what's going to happen. And then the last move you do, or not the last move, before you use your MLE, your room MLE, one of the last moves you do is you sign KT to that extension. And you use that extension to take you over the salary cap. So you sign free agents up to, if the salary cap is 134 million, you sign free agents up to 131 million to be safe. And then, while still retaining KJ's cap hold, and then since you still have his cap hold, which is essentially the bird rights, you can still give him whatever extension you want to give him because you have bird rights to take you over that. And let's say it's 15 million a year. Let's say KJ gets 15 million a year. This is just a number I just threw around. You're at 131 plus those 15, you get to 146. You're still well below the 162 tax threshold. And then on top of that, you can use your MLE, your room MLE, which is 5.6, which gets you 146, which gets you to 152. And then after that, you can still sign vetmin guys, I think. I'm fairly certain. And that will get you close to 150 something million in your total cap, which is kind of a way of exploiting using cap space and still retaining your free agents. And this is only possible because KJ Martin's salary is so low, his cap hold is also going to be really low. And so keeping that cap hold doesn't really hurt you. If you guys remember last year, we were talking about the KPJ extension. His cap hold as a first round pick would be a lot bigger than what KJ's is as an undrafted guy. And so with KPJ, this would be a lot harder to pull off because his cap hold would be 8 million or 8 to 12 million. I don't remember quite the exact number. And it would actually eat a significant amount into your cap space. The 2 million of KJ's cap hold it's basically doesn't really make much of a difference. And so you can still sign most of your guys. And after that, while you decline KJ's option, he is a restricted free agent, and then you extend them. To me, this is a lot better than holding KPJ at KPJ, not KPJ, KJ Martin at his current salary for one more year, which really doesn't benefit you much because it's the difference between being at 140 million and being at 155 million. When you can't make other moves to go further up, you're not really losing literally anything by extending him this year. But what you are doing is at that point, then we do what you were talking about of having a descending contract because the money this year doesn't matter. You can maximize the value of that contract, kind of like what they did with Jason Tate. The Rockets cap space last year didn't matter, so they paid them more last year, knowing that this year the cap space would matter. And so you can do sort of the same thing. But the only difference is that if you do it that way, you should only do it if you're planning on using the cap space this year. If you're planning on kicking cap space further out a year by signing expiring guys, then you shouldn't do this because KJ's salary will eat into your cap space next year. This is a scenario where you don't really plan to have cap space next year anyways. And so you maximize you maximize your room next year while being above the cap by a little bit, and you make KJ a better asset. I don't know how convoluted that was. Guys, remember English is not my first language, but I tried my best.
Let's spin it back to Jalen though, because I know we've been a bit all over the map. We started with the micro and went back into the macro. I know you also wanted to talk about the scenario of whether Jalen Brown, especially because of the potential 1-year component to it, makes sense in tandem with James Harden, or if you have to choose between a hypothetical pursuit of Harden or Jalen Brown in this big time trade offer. Well, I shouldn't say big time because we're both on the same page. I don't think it makes sense for the Rockets in their current state to give up Jalen, Jabari, or your 2023 first rounder for a guy whose future beyond 1 year would most likely be in some doubt. So within that construct, where are you at on the combination of Jalen with Harden? A, is it possible? And B, if it is possible, what are the routes that are realistic to you?
So I think we should call him Brown instead of Jalen going forward, so
Fair.
to make sure people don't confuse
Fair.
it. We're talking about Jalen Brown, the Celtics guy. I mean, if you were listening within context, you'd know, but if you're just skipped to this point,
Yeah.
it's better to, which I hope you didn't, because it was a good podcast up until this point. I bet you better not have skipped wherever you are listening. No, but to answer your question, I think on the court there isn't really a problem. You're looking at a James Harden, Jalen Green, Jalen Brown, Jabari Smith Jr., and whatever center you get in there, might be a free agent, might not. I'm fairly certain you can fit both of them if you trade KPJ and you trade Jason Tate. I'm fairly certain you can fit both of them into. You can trade for Jalen Brown and still sign Harden with cap space. Especially because I think Jalen Brown is not making a full max, as I said earlier. So you can make it happen. That's established. The question becomes, and it works on the court. I think that's established as well. I mean, you can't never have too much talent. And Jalen Brown is, as I said, scalable player, plays good defense. It's not like you're adding liabilities on top of each other. The question becomes long term, right? Because now you'd have James Harden on a 4-year deal, making 46 up to 50 something million a year. You'd have Jalen Brown, who you're going to have to sign to a max extension whenever he becomes a free agent, and so that's going to eat into your total cap as well. And then you're going to have to pay KJ Martin, which is, let's just scratch him because he's a role player. This is the big boys talking. You're going to have to pay Jabari Smith Jr. and Jalen Green, and potentially your pick that you bring in this year. And there's not enough money for all of that. That being said, I think at some point, yes, it's good to remain flexible and it's good to plan, a few years out. But this is such a high upside option that it doesn't really make sense to not do it in fear of not being able to pay Jalen Green or in fear of not being able to pay Jabari Smith Jr. If you're in a position to add an all-star, or what should have been an all-star, well, come on, that was a ripoff, an all-star in James Harden and an all-star in Jalen Brown, especially Jalen Brown being as young as he is, you've got to do it nearly 100% of the time. Even if it meant that you may not be able to pay Jalen Green or Jabari Smith Jr., that bringing in Jalen Brown is a no-brainer. Bringing in James Harden is not so much, but I'm not going to get to why it makes sense. When Jalen Green's extension kicks in, not when he signs it, but when it kicks in, first of all, it's a good problem to have that Jalen Green is a max player and is going to demand that type of contract. Second of all, his extension would kick in the season where James Harden has 2 years left on his deal. Jabari Smith Jr.'s extension would kick in when James Harden has 1 year left on his deal. Whoever we pick this year, their extension would only kick in after James Harden's contract has expired. My point being that if you are in a tight spot, which is, as I said, a good problem to have, where Jalen Green's a max guy, and
Right.
Jabari Smith's a max guy, and Jalen Brown's still here, I think James Harden, even on the bloater contract that he's going to have, with 2 years left, is a movable contract. We've seen time and time again guys with 2 years left on massive deals: Russell Westbrook, John Wall, Kristaps Porzingis with even more than 2 years being moved. Even if James Harden is not a good player anymore, you can still move him, even if you have to attach a couple of first-round picks. And if you have to attach a couple of first-round picks to move them, while that may sound bad, the transaction or the trade-off ends up being true first-round picks to dump Harden for the opportunity to have James Harden and Jalen Brown and Jalen Green and Jabari Smith Jr. and their pick this year all on the same team for 2 years. I think you'd pay 2 first-round picks to do that from the get-go if you were given the chance, but that's not what's happening. There's only a chance that may be necessary. I was talking about this with Frank on Twitter. Frank the Tank, shout out the chop. On Twitter, and he was mentioning that it's not as simple as just dumping Harden, because he's going to want to decide where he goes, and I disagree, because if you're dumping him and giving a team picks to take him on,
Right.
James Harden is not the incentive. The incentive is the picks packaged with him. And if you're a team taking on a salary dump of this magnitude, you're likely going to be a rebuilding team anyway. So if James Harden wants to pout and demand a trade, you're fine. Just give him the John Wall treatment, send him home, buy him
Right.
out, collect the 2 first-round picks,
Yeah, there's
and move
plenty of
on with your
precedent for
rebuild.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, it happens plenty. And so what I'm saying is, yes, you should be careful in planning out long-term what the salary books are going to look like. This is too much upside to not run the risk of it blowing up. Having too many guys to pay is a good problem to have, and you can always spend assets as long as you don't spend them all on everything on something else. You can always spend assets to dump a contract if you need to.
Mhm.
Usually, the reason teams don't dump these contracts is because they're not willing to part with those assets. But if you're in a position where Jalen Green and Jabari Smith Jr. are max guys at the age of 22, which is what they'll be 22, 23, then at that point you're more than happy to spend 2 first-round picks to be able to keep those guys. Part of it is that it's a good problem to have.
Mhm.
Part of it is you can't really define the way you handle the possible acquisition of an all-star right now by your ability or not, because you still hold the flexibility
Mhm.
to extend guys or not, by your ability or not to extend guys in the future, because you don't know. And as
Yeah.
optimistic as we want to be, there's nothing right now that tells me for certain that Jalen Green is going to be a max guy when he's extension eligible. Same thing with Jabari Smith Jr. So there's even a scenario where, hopefully it's not what happens, but there are scenarios where you Jabari Smith is not a max guy or Jalen Green is not a max guy. They're a 20 million a year guy. That's the extension that they get. That's what the DeJounte Murray got, and they eventually became an all-star. If that's the case, and if that's what ends up happening when that extensions come through, you're going to be kicking yourself that you passed upon James Harden earlier because you wanted to make sure you could pay these guys, but now these guys aren't worth what you were expecting to pay them, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, I'm right there with you on the principle. And perhaps it's because I'm a little bit older, but the last 3 years have been such that I'm not willing to turn down a certain path because of this potential rosy scenario of what happens if everything works out perfectly a few years from now in terms of what you need to give to Jalen and Jabari and what your payroll eventually looks like. No. If you can get a player of Jalen Brown's stature in the here and now, given what we have suffered through and given the inherent uncertainty that we've learned the hard way, you don't pass it up for a hypothetical. And of course, the other extreme is the Harden contract, and you worry about, well, what if it ages poorly and you might need to move that? Again, we've seen time and time again, there's almost no such thing as an unmovable contract. It's just a matter of whether you have the capital and the incentive to spend that. I mean, the Rockets could have traded John Wall. It just didn't make sense for them to take on the money slash attach the pick assets for them to do so. So it made more sense to just eventually buy him out. There's plenty of precedent for any deal being movable, especially if you're able to incentivize the other team with picks. And secondly, I also think for reasons we've outlined in recent shows, James Harden is likely to age very well. So even if you need to move that deal later on, I think he's the type of guy that even in his mid 30s, based on the form we've seen this year, I'm not too stressed out about it. The hard part is getting guys like James Harden and Jalen Brown to want to come to Houston. And if they say yes, my opinion is, yeah, you move. Well, you move heaven and earth within reason. I mean, you don't give up the farm, as you were saying earlier, for Jalen with only 1 year of commitment. But if you get them willing to come, then yeah, I'm willing to sort of throw these hypotheticals to the wayside. I'm right there with you on that principle.
Yeah, just one quick thing. I think it's important to make the distinction that we're willing to give up assets for Jalen Brown as a star, even if it's a little bit of rushing because of his age. But
Right.
James Harden, on the other hand, we're willing to. Part of the reason why we're willing to give him this contract is because you're not giving up
He's an add-on.
assets.
It's free agent.
He's
Yeah.
a free agent. You're basically adding value. So for example, if the option were to give up a bunch of assets for KD, I wouldn't do it. But getting James Harden for free in free agent, not for free, but for his contract in free agency, then that makes sense
Yeah.
because you're not spending your assets.
Yeah. But if we're talking about a 26-year-old Jalen Brown, that's someone that absolutely still fits, that is 100% still going to be in his prime at the point a few years from now when you're legitimately trying to win a title. So yeah, that's
Exactly.
why it's different. It's just you have to combine that with the reality of his contract and accounting for the, well, what if things go wrong and a year from now he has a different take on the situation. So that's the blend there. Last point before we wrap up, and I'm sure you've thought this yourself. We've done plenty of episodes about the potential coaching search. I won't go into the reasons again why I think it's likely the Rockets are going to be in that market. The biggest, of course, are simply financial, with nothing reportedly owed to Steven Silas after this season. But there's been a lot reported about Ime Udoka and Jalen Brown and their relationship. And so for people wondering, why would Jalen Brown, aside from the hypothetical of, well, Houston is a big market and it could be his team, why would he go from a team like the Celtics, that's one of the best in the league, to a team like the Rockets, that's one of the worst? Besides those factors, you do have an option to pair him up with his coach. And that's something that I suspect has appeal. So that's just a little thing to think about, but it certainly can't hurt the cause, right?
Yeah, and not only that, even if Jalen Brown's not coming, I think he may look at, depending on what ends up coming of
Yeah, he
his
may still
problems
make
with the
sense.
Celtics,
Yeah.
he still makes sense. And both make sense without Brown, and it makes sense to bring in Ime Udoka partly because of Brown and not pursue him right now. You can
Hmm.
still bring in Ime Udoka, and he's a good coach with James Harden. He might lead you to a playing spot, and now Jalen Brown's hitting free agency, and you might get the jackpot where you didn't give up the assets for him. Now he's a free agent. You've got a coach he likes. You're looking
Yep.
like a promising young team. You have another star in James Harden, and you can still you. And another point, you can still open up enough cap space if you don't extend KJ Martin, or if you do,
Hmm.
you have to trade them.
Yep.
You can still open up enough cap space without giving up core pieces to make a run at Jalen Brown, not this offseason, the next one, while keeping Jalen Green, Jabari Smith Jr., your pick this year, and James Harden.
All right. Well, there's an optimistic note to leave on. So why don't we break it here? We thought this would be a little bit of a shorter episode, but man, we can never be short. Come on, that's just not our thing. So
It's what you signed up for at this point.
yeah, exactly. You know what's coming. All right. Well, finally, we'll bring it to a close. For Paolo, I'm Ben. If you want more content before the next show, I am on Twitter at Ben Dubose. Paolo's on there at Paolo Alves NBA. And this show, The Logger Line, is on there at The Logger Line. That's where you can go to our link tree and access not just our distributors, Apple, Google, Spotify, all the places that you can listen, but also our partners and sponsors, Sports Talk 790, Rockets Wire, Carbach Brewing. You can check out their content, their offerings as well. And if you talk to somebody from there, tell them that the Logger Line told you to check them out. We would greatly appreciate that. Again, Sports Talk 790, Carbach Brewing, and Rockets Wire are friends here at the Logger Line, the folks helping us bring this show to you at least once per week. With that, we will close. For Paolo, I'm Ben. Thanks as always for listening, and please come back soon for another new episode of the Logger Line.